The silk pillow was already pressed down over Rosalind Castellano's face when Adeline pushed open the bedroom door. The old woman's hand clawed at the wooden bed frame, thin fingers curling for air that would not come. Sloane never heard the footsteps behind her. She was leaning close, whispering in a voice sweet as a lullaby. Just a little longer, then everything will be the way it should be. Adeline didn't stop to think. She lunged, seized that platinum blonde hair, and wrenched it backward with every ounce of strength left in her heavily pregnant body. The pillow hit the floor. The old woman pulled in one long, terrible breath. The sound of someone hauled up from beneath the ice. Sloane staggered around, eyes wild, a smear of red lipstick across her cheek, and in that exact moment, the hallway light came on. Emmett Castellano stood in the doorway, snow still unmelted on the shoulders of his black coat, his car keys slipping from his hand onto the carpet. He had come home 2 days early. This whole city was afraid of that man, and yet he could not make himself take a single step. And not one soul in that house knew that the woman who had just saved his mother was holding a truth far more frightening than anything they had just seen. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. 7 months before that night, Adeline Rourke sat alone at the bus stop at the end of Kedzie, on the city's west side, where the wind off the lake slipped through the gaps between buildings and struck people full in the face like a rejection. The stop had no shelter, only an iron bench so cold that she had to sit on both hands. In the pocket of her coat was an envelope that had been opened and folded shut again so many times that the edges of the paper had gone soft. It was the hospital bill for her mother-in-law, who had died in the fall, and the figure printed in bold at the lower right corner was greater than everything Adeline earned in a year. Around her left wrist, a metal stopwatch hung loosely, its leather strap stretched because it had never been made for a woman's wrist. It had belonged to Elliot. She still wore it every day, and every day she had to push it a little farther up her arm to keep it from slipping off. The bus was late. Adeline didn't look at the time. She had learned that looking wouldn't make it come any faster. The woman sat down beside her without Adeline hearing a single footstep. She appeared to be in her early 60s, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a wine-colored wool scarf, one hand carrying a paper bag that smelled of warm waffles. She didn't ask the time or which bus route this was. She spoke Adeline's full name, including Elliot's last name, and said she was deeply sorry about what had happened in April. Adeline turned toward her, and in that moment she felt something suspended between fear and exhaustion, the feeling of someone life had struck too many times to startle anymore, someone who could only wait to see where the next blow would land. She asked who the woman was. The woman said her name was Marguerite Delacroix, that she had been a nurse for 30 years, and that she was looking for someone to take over a job she could no longer continue doing. Then she looked down, not at Adeline's face, but at the place where her loose coat closed over her belly. Instinctively, Adeline pulled the front of the coat tighter. She had only just entered her 3rd month. She hadn't told anyone at the hospital. She hadn't told anyone at all. Marguerite made no comment. She merely took a piece of paper folded into quarters from her bag and placed it on Adeline's knee, the way someone might set down something they had considered for a very long time. Written on it was an address in Lake Forest, nearly an hour's drive north, and beneath the address was a number. Adeline looked at that number and had to read it a second time. It was 3 times what the hospital paid her for a month of work, 3 times as much to care for one person, in a private home, during the day. She asked why Marguerite had chosen her. She said there were thousands of nurses in the city, many of them better than she was, many of them with fewer obligations, and none of them had to carry a steadily growing belly with them to work. Marguerite was silent for a long while. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of waffles from the paper bag, a warmth that felt strangely out of place on an evening like that. Then she said she didn't need the best person. She needed someone desperate enough not to ask any more questions, and decent enough to do what was right even without asking them. She said it calmly, without the slightest apology, like a doctor reading aloud the results of a test. Adeline looked at her, and it wasn't the number that made her take the piece of paper. It was the slight trembling in Marguerite's hand as she held it out. 4 days later, Adeline stood before an iron gate, twice her height, at the end of a paved road that had no name on any map. Beyond the gate, rows of pine trees stood in perfect lines, and farther beyond them lay Lake Michigan beneath a sheet of ice, white and silent as an untouched bedsheet. Cameras were mounted at the tops of the posts, beneath the corners of the roof, and wherever the fence turned, and every one of them followed her. 2 men in dark coats opened the gate for her, carried her bag, and showed her the way. Yet neither of them looked directly into her face even once. They spoke to the floor, to the empty space beside her shoulder, to something behind her back. Adeline crossed the great entrance hall beneath its high ceiling, and over rugs so thick they swallowed every sound her shoes made. And she realized that in this house, no sound was ever accidental. The woman in the second-floor bedroom lay on her side, facing the window. Rosalind Castellano was 74 years old, paralyzed on the right side after a stroke, her silver hair neatly combed, her hands resting on the blanket like two forgotten objects. Adeline greeted her. Rosalind didn't answer. Adeline brought her morning medication. She didn't turn her head. Adeline set a bowl of oatmeal on the small table beside the bed, sat down in the chair, and waited. Half an hour later, she carried the untouched bowl back downstairs to the kitchen. The same thing happened the next day, and again on the third. For 3 days, the woman didn't say a single word to her, and Adeline began to understand that they weren't paying her 3 times as much because the work was difficult, but because many others before her had walked away. On the morning of the 4th day, Adeline didn't bring the medication tray upstairs. She left it on the kitchen counter, climbed the stairs empty-handed, pulled the chair close to the bed, and sat there without speaking for a long while. The woman in the bed still had her face turned toward the window, where the winter light poured in, pale and white, without the slightest trace of warmth. Adeline followed her gaze, looking out at the frozen lake, stretching to the place where sky and water could no longer be told apart, and then she asked a question that had nothing to do with medicine, and nothing to do with breakfast. She asked what Rosalind wanted to listen to when darkness fell. The silence lasted so long that Adeline was about to rise. Then the old woman's left hand lifted slightly from the blanket, slow and trembling, and pointed toward the corner of the room. There, beneath a faded cloth cover, stood an old wooden record player, with a brass-hinged lid and a needle arm as slender as a blade of dry grass. Beside it was a stack of vinyl records leaning inside a wooden box. Adeline went through them one by one. The cover of the one in the middle was worn at all 4 corners, its front so faded that she could barely make out the image of a brass horn, and along the bottom edge was a line written in pencil, slanted and so faint that not a single word remained fully legible. She chose it because it was the only cover in the box that bore the marks of human hands. She placed the record on the turntable, lowered the needle, and a brief crackle sounded as it touched the groove before the music began. It was a slow jazz piece, the piano entering first, the horn following after, the kind of music that belonged to small living rooms and long evenings. Adeline returned to her chair, and then she saw it. Rosalind Castellano's left hand was tapping against the blanket. It wasn't the unconscious movement of a sick woman. It wasn't trembling. Her index and middle fingers tapped in perfect time, following the beat, slowing when the horn held a long, lingering note, then picking it up again with flawless precision when the piano returned. Adeline sat perfectly still. She had cared for enough people to know the difference between reflex and awareness, and she understood that the woman lying there, the woman everyone in that house treated like a piece of furniture that needed dusting, wasn't confused in the slightest. She simply didn't want to speak to people she hadn't chosen. That night, she took all her medicine. She didn't speak or look at Adeline, but she took it. And from that day forward, when the lights along the lakeshore began to come on, Adeline played that record. It became something they never discussed and never named, something that simply repeated itself night after night, until the others in the house learned to avoid the second-floor hallway at that hour. Rosalind began to eat, then she began to speak. Her voice was slow and broken, every sentence interrupted by pauses for breath, and the right half of her face barely moved, so Adeline had to learn to listen with her eyes as much as with her ears. Rosalind told her about an afternoon long ago, when her son was still a little boy, and found a sparrow with a broken wing in the backyard. He carried it into the house, wrapped in the front of his shirt. He wouldn't let anyone touch it. He sat beside it and kept watch all night. By morning, the bird was dead, and the boy cried until he couldn't breathe, the way children cry only once in their lives, before they learn that the world has no intention of bargaining with anyone. When she finished the story, Rosalind was silent for a long time. Then she added that he had never cried that way again. Not once, not even at his father's funeral. Adeline didn't know how to answer, so she didn't. She leaned down and pulled the blanket up to the old woman's chest, and as she bent forward, the front of her uniform drew tight. Rosalind looked down. She looked longer than a passing glance. Then she said, slowly and clearly, that Adeline should start sitting down when she brought the tray instead of standing, because standing too long would make her back ache, and that she had noticed it during Adeline's first week. Adeline went still, one hand still holding the edge of the blanket. She hadn't told anyone in that house. The old woman asked no further questions. She merely turned her face toward the window and said that there were things in this house best known by only 2 people. Then she closed her eyes and let the music play to the end, until the needle slipped beyond the final groove. He came home on a night near the end of the month, after weeks in which no one in the house had spoken his name. Adeline didn't hear the car, the gate, or even the front door, because everyone in that house had learned how to move without leaving a sound behind. She knew someone had returned only when the 2 lamps beside the driveway went dark at the same moment. And she didn't have time to think much about it because Rosalind had a mild fever that night, and Adeline had remained with her since darkness fell. She sat in the armchair close to the head of the bed, her notebook open on her lap, a pen held between her fingers. She recorded Rosalind's temperature, the times she drank water, and how many times the old woman turned in bed. Then she added another line she wouldn't remember writing, the words tilting lower and lower until they slipped toward the edge of the page, and she fell asleep with her chin resting against her shoulder. Emmett Castellano climbed the stairs shortly before dawn. He hadn't intended to enter his mother's room. He merely saw a narrow blade of light shining through the gap beneath the door. And in a house where everything was turned off at the appointed hour, a light at that time was something unusual. He pushed the door open. The old woman was asleep, breathing evenly, the blanket drawn up to her chest, her left hand stretched out above it as though she had been tapping out a rhythm before drifting off. In the chair, the woman he had never spoken to was sleeping with her notebook sliding from her lap, one corner of its cover touching the floor. He stood there longer than necessary. He looked at the empty tray, at the record player with its needle arm lifted and returned carefully to its proper place, and at the glass of water with its straw bent toward his mother's left hand instead of her right. Details like those weren't written into anyone's employment contract. He removed his overcoat, the black wool still holding the cold of the road he had just traveled, folded it once, and laid it over her shoulders. He didn't wake her. He bent down, picked up the notebook, and placed it on the small table without opening it. Then he left, and closed the door so gently that the latch made almost no sound. The following morning, Adeline woke with the coat over her shoulders and a feeling she couldn't explain. The feeling of a woman who had grown accustomed to sleeping in the cold and had suddenly awakened warm. She found him in the small dining room on the east side of the house, sitting alone before a cup of black coffee and a stack of unopened papers. She placed the neatly folded coat over the back of the chair across from him. He looked up. The butler standing in the doorway said that the master had finished his breakfast and asked whether he should clear the table. Emmett waved him away. Then he asked Adeline what had happened the night before. She said the old woman's temperature had reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but it had come down, and she had eaten half a bowl. He asked why she hadn't called the doctor. She said that calling a doctor in the middle of the night for a mild fever would have awakened and frightened the old woman, and fear would have done her more harm than the fever. He watched her for a moment, with the gaze of a man accustomed to judging whether an answer had been prepared in advance. Then he told her to keep doing what she believed was right. Adeline nodded and took 2 steps toward the door before stopping. She thanked him for the coat and called him Emmett. The pen in his hand paused for half a beat above the paper. The butler in the doorway looked up as well. No one said anything. Adeline left the room, and it wasn't until she reached the foot of the stairs that she realized she had never once heard anyone call him by that name in the 4 weeks she had lived in that house. The engagement party was held on the ground floor one evening early in the month, and Adeline learned about it only when the butler handed her an apron of a different color and told her she would help carry trays that night because the house was short-staffed. His name was Halloran. He had served the family for so long that no one could clearly remember when he had begun. He was thin, with a straight back and a voice that never rose above what was necessary. He presented the apron with both hands, as neatly as if he were delivering an official document, and instructed her to remain at the edge of the room, never cross through the center, and never look directly at the guests. Adeline did exactly as she was told. She stood close to the western wall with a tray in her hands, and from there, she watched the entire room as though it were a stage on which she had no part to play. She saw Emmett at the head of the long table. He spoke little and listened often, and every time he opened his mouth, the people around him leaned slightly in his direction, a movement so subtle that they probably didn't even realize they were making it. Sloane Whitmore sat to his left, one hand resting lightly on his forearm, smiling at everyone and always smiling at precisely the right moment. Then a man sitting 3 seats away, his face flushed and his voice already louder than a courteous evening allowed, interrupted Emmett in the middle of a sentence to offer his opinion about the southern shipping route, saying it should have been handled differently since the summer. Emmett didn't answer. He didn't raise a hand, lift his voice, or set his glass down any harder than usual. He merely looked up and fixed his eyes on the man. Adeline would remember that moment for a very long time, because what happened next didn't involve a single word. The laughter at the far end of the table died first, then the sound of knives and forks. Then the entire room, more than 30 grown adults, fell silent one by one, as though someone were slowly lowering a lever. The red-faced man sat motionless for several seconds. Then he said, of his own accord, that he had spoken out of turn and that he was sorry. He said it twice. Emmett gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned to the person on his right, and resumed the conversation. The room began to breathe again. Adeline remained where she was, the tray still in her hands, and realized that her heart was beating faster even though nothing had happened at all. She had worked in the emergency department for 4 years. She had stood among men shouting in hospital corridors at midnight. Never once had she felt a silence so heavy. Near the end of the evening, she was summoned upstairs to bring the old woman down to greet the guests. Rosalind sat in her wheelchair, her hair neatly combed, and her left hand resting in her lap, while Adeline pushed her through the great hall toward the parlor. Just as they reached the turn, Sloane approached from the opposite direction. She walked quickly, her heels striking the stone floor in an even rhythm, and passed within less than an arm's length of the wheelchair. She didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She didn't turn her head. Not a single glance fell upon the woman seated there. Then she called for Halloran and, without looking back, told him to move that chair out of the way before the photographer came in. That chair. Adeline felt both hands tighten around the handles until her knuckles turned white. Halloran bowed his head and said, "Yes, miss." Then he stepped forward and placed a hand on the chair without looking at Adeline even once. Adeline opened her mouth to say something. Then she looked down. Rosalind was gazing up at her, and the old woman gave the faintest shake of her head, a movement so slight that no one standing 2 feet away would have noticed it. Adeline swallowed the words. She stepped back half a pace and allowed Halloran to push the wheelchair in another direction, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the hall with an empty tray in her hands. It happened on a weekend morning, when Halloran handed Adeline a brown document folder and said the old woman needed the master's signature on some health insurance papers, and that the master was down at the docks that day and wouldn't be returning home. He said it in his usual even voice, presented the folder with both hands as he always did, and turned away before Adeline had time to ask anything more. The car took more than an hour to carry her south through the city, along the Calumet River, where the water was black and thick as motor oil, to a row of gray corrugated metal warehouses standing at the edge of a container yard. The driver stopped outside a warehouse marked 4 in peeling white paint, pointed to the small office attached to its side, then turned off the engine and didn't accompany her. Adeline walked toward it. The office door was closed, but the upper part of the partition was glass, and she stood waiting in the corridor outside with the folder pressed to her chest, and she saw everything. There were 2 men inside. Emmett sat on one side of the desk, his coat draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. Across desk him sat a large man in his 50s wearing a dockworker's jacket, both hands resting on the desk as though he couldn't decide whether to leave them there or pull them back. Adeline couldn't make out every word through the glass, but she could hear the rhythm. Emmett spoke very slowly. He held no papers. He recited numbers, one series after another, shipment codes, arrival dates, the weights recorded on the manifests and the weights actually received, the size of each discrepancy, and then he moved on to the next shipment. He recited them the way someone might recite an old prayer from memory. He didn't get a single number wrong. He didn't pause for breath. Not once did he have to look down. Standing outside, Adeline felt a chill creep slowly along her spine, because she understood that the numbers themselves weren't what made the scene frightening. What frightened her was that they stretched across many months. What frightened her was that he had known for a very long time, had eaten with this man, shaken his hand at the harbor gate, allowed everything to continue week after week, and waited in silence until this precise morning. The man began to speak. His words came quickly, his hands clasped together, his head bowing lower and lower. Then he left his chair and sank to his knees on the concrete floor. Emmett didn't move. He looked down at the man for several seconds, then spoke a short sentence, and although Adeline couldn't hear it, she could read the words on his lips. He told the man to stand up. The man lifted his head, bewildered. Emmett went on to say that he didn't need anyone kneeling before him. Kneeling was easy, and forgetting was easy. What he needed was for the man to remember long enough that they would never have to sit together in that room a second time. The man rose. He left through the door on the other side and walked across the container yard without looking back once. Adeline stepped away from the glass, and at that exact moment, Emmett turned toward the corridor. He had known she was standing there, though she couldn't tell for how long. On the way home, they sat together in the back seat, the signed folder lying between them. The car traveled along the lakeshore, and for nearly half the journey neither of them spoke. Then he broke the silence and said that she had seen it. It wasn't a question. Adeline looked out the window at the gray water and the motionless cranes receding behind them, then said she had worked night shifts in the emergency department for 4 years. She had bandaged people whose deeds, if he knew about them, would make him unwilling to share a car with them, yet she had still been required to keep them alive until morning. She said she had no right to fear him any more than she had feared those people. He was silent for a while, then the corner of his mouth lifted, barely at all, in something that resembled both a smile and exhaustion. And it was the first time Adeline had ever seen that man smile. The changes began with things so small that no one thought they were worth opposing. First, the curtains in the old woman's room, made of brown velvet faded along the folds, were replaced with a heavier, more opaque fabric in pale gray, and 3 days later Adeline realized that Rosalind could no longer see the lake in the morning. Then the armchair beside the bed was moved into the hallway, because Sloane said it took up too much space. Then came the change in her medical schedule. Dr. Feldman had cared for the old woman for many years. He knew which medications she was allergic to, knew that her stammer grew worse on days when the wind changed, and had a habit of remaining with her for 15 minutes after every examination, simply to talk, even though no one paid him for those 15 minutes. One Thursday afternoon, he arrived, was shown into the parlor, and never went upstairs. The following morning, another man entered the house carrying a new leather briefcase. His name was Preston Ashby, and Halloran introduced him as the family's private physician in the same even voice that revealed nothing. Ashby examined Rosalind for 7 minutes. He didn't ask her a single question. He asked only Sloane. Adeline stood at the foot of the bed and counted exactly 2 times when he looked into his patient's face, both times to examine her pupils. Before leaving, he wrote a new prescription and said the old dosage didn't appear suitable for someone her age. Adeline asked what he meant by suitable. He closed his briefcase and told her that she was a nurse, not a doctor, then walked downstairs. From that day forward, something began repeating itself in the house, something only Adeline witnessed in its entirety. In the evenings, when Emmett returned home, Sloane would recount the old woman's day in a voice filled with gentle concern, and there was always some new detail in the story. Rosalind had forgotten a servant's name. She had asked what day it was 3 times. Then one evening, Sloane said that the old woman had called her by another name, the name of some woman no one in the house had ever heard of, and she lowered her eyes as she said perhaps it was time to consider specialized care. Adeline stood on the top stair with a stack of clean towels in her arms, and she knew exactly what had happened that afternoon. Sloane had entered the room without knocking. Rosalind had turned her head, looked directly into her face, and called her by that name with perfect clarity, more clearly than anything else she had said all day. Then, after Sloane left, the old woman lay still, and the left corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. Adeline had seen it. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was a woman who could no longer hold a spoon, using the last weapon she still possessed. But Emmett hadn't seen it. He had only heard the story. And he had heard it from the woman he was about to marry. The incident in the greenhouse happened one afternoon near the end of the month. Adeline went to cut a few sprigs of rosemary for the old woman's oatmeal, passed through the side walkway covered in climbing vines, and stopped when she heard Sloane's voice on the other side of the glass, clouded with steam. She was speaking on the phone. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was dry and quick, the voice of someone calculating rather than conversing. She said the notarization appointment had already been scheduled and couldn't be moved, and she made it clear that everything had to be finished before that date, completely finished, with no loose ends left behind. Then she added that the person on the other end shouldn't call that number again. Adeline stood motionless behind the glass wall, still clutching the rosemary in one hand. She didn't understand what the notarization appointment was, what it concerned, or who was on the other end of the call. She knew only one simple thing, something 4 years of working night shifts had taught her. When someone spoke about a deadline in a voice like that, whatever lay beyond that deadline was never anything good. The clear plastic pill organizer lay in the second drawer of the nightstand, divided into 7 compartments for 7 days, with each compartment divided again into morning and evening. Adeline filled it herself every Sunday afternoon, counted twice, and recorded the number of pills remaining in each bottle on the back page of her notebook. It was a habit she had carried with her from the emergency department, the kind of habit people outside the profession regarded as needless trouble, while those inside it understood that it existed because someone had once died without it. It began on a Tuesday morning. The morning compartment was empty. Not empty because the old woman had taken her medication, but empty because the blood thinner had never been removed. And Adeline's notes clearly showed that she had still seen it there the previous evening. She asked everyone in the house. The housekeeper said she knew nothing. Halloran said he never touched anything in the mistress's room. When Adeline asked Sloane, she merely raised an eyebrow and said perhaps Adeline herself had forgotten to put it in. Everyone forgot things sometimes, especially when they were tired. 2 days later, the pill reappeared in its proper compartment. Adeline looked at it, and a coldness passed through her entire body. It was the wrong color. The blood thinner the old woman normally took was pale yellow and oval, with lettering engraved on one side. The pill in that morning's compartment was ivory white, round, smooth on both sides, and slightly smaller. An ordinary person wouldn't have noticed anything. An ordinary person might even have blamed herself for remembering it incorrectly. But Adeline had counted medication for 4 years through nights when a mistake meant losing a human life, and her hand recognized the pill before her mind could name it. It was a sedative, and judging from its size, the dosage wasn't intended for a 74-year-old woman who weighed less than 110 pounds. She didn't give it to Rosalind. She wrapped the pill in a piece of wax paper, folded it closed, and tucked it into an inner pocket of her handbag. But Adeline could protect her only during the day. In the evening, when she went home, the night shift belonged to someone else. Over the next 2 weeks, Adeline watched the woman decline in a way that made her grip the edge of the chair to keep from saying aloud what she was thinking. Rosalind's stammer grew worse. Sentences that had already come slowly now broke apart halfway through and couldn't be joined again. In the mornings, she never fully awakened. On some days, Adeline sat beside the bed for nearly an hour, while Rosalind merely stared at the ceiling, her pupils responding slowly to light, her left hand lying still, no longer tapping out a rhythm. The music still played when the lights along the lakeshore came on, but that hand remained motionless on the blanket through the entire record, and that frightened Adeline more than anything she could read on the chart of vital signs. Then came the afternoon when Rosalind fell in the bathroom. Adeline had left only to retrieve clean towels from the cabinet at the end of the hallway, and when she returned, the old woman was on the floor, one shoulder resting against the base of the sink, her eyes open but unable to focus. There were no serious injuries. Adeline helped her up, examined her from head to toe, and while wiping her face, her hands trembled so badly that she had to begin again twice. Ashby was summoned. He gave Rosalind a brief examination, added another line to her medical record, and said this was a normal progression in an elderly patient who had suffered a stroke. Sloane stood in the doorway, nodded, and said how fortunate it was that she had been home. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Adeline sat at the desk in her room, opened her notebook to a blank page, and began writing everything down. These were no longer ordinary nursing notes. She drew columns, date, the medication that should have been present, the medication that was actually there, who entered the room during that period, who left it. The following morning, before opening the pill organizer, she took out her phone and photographed all 7 compartments. She also photographed the drawer while it was still closed, making sure the date shown on the lock screen appeared in the image as well. And every morning after that, she did exactly the same thing. Adeline waited 3 days for an evening when he came home early and remained in the house alone. She waited until Halloran had gone to bed, until only one wall lamp remained lit in the ground floor hallway, then carried her notebook and the folded piece of wax paper inside it down to the study, and knocked twice. He told her to come in without looking up. The room was heavy with the smell of old paper and cold coffee. He sat behind the desk with a stack of open files before him, his tie removed, and when he saw her, he closed the document he had been reading and gestured toward the chair across from him. Adeline didn't sit. She said she needed to speak to him about his mother's medication, and that some of the pills in the organizer didn't match the prescription. He looked up. She opened the notebook and placed it on the desk. She had only managed to explain that the pill from Thursday wasn't the blood thinner Rosalind normally took, that she had saved it, that she had photographs from every day, and that she wanted him to look through everything from the first page. When the door opened, Sloane entered carrying a tray of tea. She didn't knock or wait. She simply pushed the door open with her elbow, as though she were entering a room of her own. She set the tray on the corner of the desk, poured a cup, and slid it toward Emmett. Then she turned to Adeline and smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and a very slow one. She apologized for interrupting, then told Emmett in the gentle voice she always used at the dinner table that darling, Mrs. Rourke was pregnant and working long shifts, and people in her condition sometimes became so tired that they remembered things incorrectly and imagined things that weren't there. She had seen it happen to her own cousin. She said she didn't blame Adeline in the slightest. Then she added that Dr. Ashby himself had adjusted the prescription the previous week, that all the paperwork was in order, and that Mrs. Rourke probably hadn't been informed, which was why she had become so alarmed. Adeline listened to every sentence, and felt each one closing around her like a succession of doors in a long corridor. She turned toward Emmett. He wasn't looking at Sloane. He was looking at her. He looked at the open notebook on the desk, at her hand holding the edge of the page, and for half a second something passed across his face. A hesitation so slight it was like a crack in the surface of ice, something a person would miss if they blinked. Adeline saw it. She had spent 4 years making a living by reading people's faces, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had seen it. Then he blinked. He turned to Sloane and nodded. He said he would ask Ashby about it the next day. He told Adeline that she should get some rest. His voice wasn't harsh. If anything, it carried something almost like concern, and that was the worst part of all. Adeline closed her notebook. She said, "Yes, Emmett," then picked it up and left the room. She closed the door very gently behind her. She walked 4 steps down the hallway and stopped. From inside, she heard the soft sound of a teacup touching its saucer, and Sloane laughing quietly about something else. Adeline leaned back against the wall between 2 paintings she had never examined closely, and she slipped down a little until her shoulders touched the cold wood paneling. She placed one hand across her belly. She stood that way for a very long time. Then she began to cry without making a sound, her shoulders trembling in the darkness of a hallway no one passed through, and it was the first time she had cried since the morning Elliot's coffin was lowered into the ground. The letter arrived on a morning so ordinary that Adeline would later be unable to remember whether the sun had been shining. The envelope was ivory white and heavy, with the embossed seal of the Illinois State Board of Nursing in the upper left corner. Halloran handed it to her with both hands, as he handed her everything, then stood there waiting until she took it before turning away. She opened it at the foot of the stairs. The letter stated that the board had received a formal complaint regarding the disappearance of a specially regulated controlled substance from St. Brendan Medical Center, where she had once worked night shifts. A vial of morphine had vanished from the locked medication cabinet. Security camera footage showed her opening that cabinet on a particular night, and her nursing license was being considered for suspension while the matter was investigated. Adeline read the entire letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the second step from the bottom, in the middle of that vast entrance hall, and remembered the night named in the letter. She remembered it clearly. It was the night the old woman had a fever, the night before Adeline woke with Emmett's coat over her shoulders. She had driven to St. Brendan shortly before 1 in the morning, because there was no fever medication in the house that could safely be given to someone taking a blood thinner, and she still had her employee identification card and still had access to the outpatient pharmacy storeroom. She had signed the log. She had taken exactly 1 blister pack of fever medication, entered it on the form, and left in less than 4 minutes. It was recorded in the log. It was recorded by the camera. The problem was that the camera had also recorded her opening the locked cabinet because the medication she needed was kept on its upper shelf, above the lower compartment where the specially regulated drugs were stored. Anyone who watched the footage without reading the withdrawal log would see only one thing: a nurse opening the cabinet containing morphine at 1 in the morning. Adeline called an old friend who still worked at St. Brendan, a pharmacist named Delphine who hadn't left that storeroom in 30 years. She asked her to read the inventory report from that day, slowly, 1 line at a time. Delphine read it aloud. Cabinet number, inventory date, name of the drug. Then she came to the batch number of the vial reported missing. Adeline wrote the number in pencil along the edge of the letter, thanked her, and ended the call. Then she went upstairs, opened her computer, and searched the number in the public database of the Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency. She read the result and sat motionless for a very long time. The entire batch bearing that number had been recalled by the manufacturer long before, in a nationwide recall caused by a packaging defect. Not a single vial from that batch was still permitted to circulate in any medical facility in the state. That meant the vial of morphine they claimed Adeline had taken had never been inside that locked cabinet. It had never existed. It existed only on paper. In a line of data someone had entered into the hospital's medication management system, assigned to a dead batch number so no one would search for physical evidence, and placed on the exact night when the camera happened to capture Adeline opening the cabinet. Adeline rose and walked to the window. Outside, the ice along the edge of the lake had begun to melt, patches of black water spreading through the white like ink stains across a tablecloth. She thought of Sloane. She thought of the smile in the study, the tea tray, and the way Sloane had spoken about people imagining things. Then she realized something that sent an icy chill down her spine. Sloane Whitmore managed a real estate investment fund in the Loop. She had money. She had lawyers. She could bribe a private physician like Ashby. She could replace curtains and drive someone out of the house in a single afternoon. But she didn't have login credentials for St. Brendan's internal medication management system. No one could buy those with cash in a parking lot. To create a medication vial on paper, someone had to sit before a screen with a valid login, understand the structure of the forms, know which batch number was dead so no one would search for evidence, and know the exact night Adeline had been inside the storeroom. Adeline pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Someone in that house had been watching her even more closely than she had been watching the pill organizer, and that person wasn't the woman preparing for her wedding downstairs. The suspension order came 9 days later, arriving by email before dawn, a scanned page with a seal in the corner, and a line stating that the nursing license of Mrs. Adeline Rourke was temporarily inactive, pending the conclusion of the investigation. Halloran knocked on her door at 7:30. He said nothing about the letter. He merely told her that the car would be waiting at the front entrance in 1 hour, then stepped back half a pace and closed the door. Adeline packed her belongings into the same bag she had carried there 7 months earlier. She went upstairs for the last time. Rosalind had been seated in her wheelchair beside the window, the gray curtains partly drawn, and when Adeline entered, the old woman turned her head with startling speed, faster than anything she had managed in many weeks. Adeline crouched in front of the wheelchair. She said she had to leave. She said it was only temporary. She heard her own voice, and knew she was lying. Rosalind didn't answer. She looked at Adeline for a long time, then lifted her left hand from her lap, and began tapping against the metal frame of the wheelchair. 3 taps. A pause, then 5 taps. Another pause, then she began again. Slowly and distinctly, without taking her eyes from Adeline's face. Adeline took hold of the hand, thinking Rosalind was anxious, thinking it was merely the restlessness of a sick woman watching someone familiar prepare to leave. She stroked the back of Rosalind's hand and told her not to skip breakfast. The old woman closed her eyes. Sloane was waiting on the steps outside the front door, dressed in a cream-colored fur coat and holding a cup of coffee. She said she was deeply sorry about what had happened, that she was certain everything would be cleared up, and that perhaps, after all, this was a good thing, because a woman in Adeline's condition needed rest and needed to think of the baby first. Her voice remained gentle from beginning to end. She even touched Adeline lightly on the arm as she spoke the final sentence. Adeline looked down at that hand, then raised her eyes to Sloane's face, and didn't say a word. She carried her bag down the steps, climbed into the car, and never looked back at the house. Without a license, no hospital would hire her. No clinic would hire her. Not even the places that paid hourly wages for overnight staff would take her. Adeline visited 4 places in 2 weeks, and heard the same answer every time. At last, she found work in a cold storage warehouse on the southwest side of the city, where frozen goods were sorted by regional code and workers were paid by the shift. No one asked for professional credentials. They asked only whether she could tolerate temperatures below freezing. The shift lasted from night until dawn. She wore 3 layers beneath her protective suit, thick gloves that made it impossible to hold a pen, and pushed metal carts through narrow aisles between 2 walls of cardboard boxes, covered in a thin layer of frost. The air was so dry that her lips cracked after the second night. She lasted 11 nights. On the 12th, she was pulling a cart through the final aisle, when everything in her field of vision tilted at a strange angle, and the roar of the compressors began receding as though someone were slowly turning down the volume. She had just enough time to think that she needed to grab the shelving on her right. Then she thought nothing at all. She woke in a room with a white ceiling and the smell of antiseptic, the smell she had breathed for 4 years while standing on the other side of the bed. There was a clip on the tip of her finger and a bag of intravenous fluid hanging to her left. The doctor on duty stood at the foot of the bed, a woman about Adeline's age, and said that everything was all right, that she was suffering from exhaustion and dehydration, and that from now on she needed complete rest. No cold storage warehouse, no night shifts, nothing heavier than a bag of groceries. The doctor delivered the final instruction in the voice of someone who had said it many times and knew that most patients wouldn't listen. Adeline nodded. The doctor left the room. Then Adeline turned her head to the right. In the corner beside the window stood a plastic chair for a patient's family. Emmett Castellano was sitting there. His black wool coat was draped across his lap, his shirt sleeves still rolled to his elbows as they had been that day in the warehouse, his jaw darkened by a full night without shaving. She didn't know how long he had been sitting there, but one look at him told her it had been a long time. She meant to ask how he had known. She opened her mouth, but her throat was so dry that no sound came out. Emmett rose, poured water from the plastic pitcher on the bedside table, placed a straw in the glass, bent it toward her, and handed it to her. He didn't explain anything. He waited until she had finished the entire glass of water before sitting on the edge of the chair, his elbows resting on his knees, and said he had a job he wanted to offer her. Adeline said she no longer had a license. He said he knew. He said the job he was talking about didn't require one. Then he gave her the title. Household manager, responsible for the daily schedule, meals, guests, paperwork, and everyone who entered or left the house. He said the salary would be exactly the same as before. Adeline lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling. She asked why. She asked whether there truly wasn't anyone else in the entire city he could hire. Someone who wasn't under investigation by the board. Someone who hadn't been ordered by a doctor to rest. He didn't answer that question. He looked toward the window, where dawn was beginning to break, casting across his face the gray light of a winter morning in that city, and said only that there were too many people in his house who knew how to answer when he asked, and too few who knew how to speak when he didn't. Then he stood, draped his coat over his arm, and said the car would collect her whenever the doctor discharged her. If she didn't want the position, she could simply send word, and no one would trouble her again. He had reached the door when she called his name. He stopped. Adeline said she accepted, but she had one condition. She would have complete authority over who was allowed onto the second floor and at what hours. He was silent for exactly 3 beats. Then he said yes and left. Adeline wasn't there to witness Sloane's reaction. She knew only that when she returned, the armchair beside the old woman's bed had been brought in from the hallway and restored to its proper place, and no one said a single word to her about it. On the morning Adeline came back, Sloane stood at the top of the staircase with one hand resting on the banister, smiling at her exactly as she always had. She said how glad she was to see Adeline well again, that the house had been terribly disordered lately, and how wonderful it was to have someone managing everything. Adeline nodded, thanked her, and walked past her to go upstairs. That was the entirety of their conversation. The first time Adeline entered that house, she had carried a piece of paper in her pocket and hadn't known whom she was going to meet. This time, she entered with a notebook in her handbag, an ivory white pill wrapped in wax paper, and a dead batch number she had memorized so completely that she could recite it backward. She reached the final stair, opened the door to the old woman's room, and knew exactly what she had returned to do. The first thing Adeline did once she had authority over who could enter the second floor was stop every new prescription and restore the old medications according to the original medical record. Within 9 days, the woman in the bed began to return. She slept less during the day. Her eyes followed the light. Her speech remained slow, but her sentences no longer broke apart halfway through. And one evening, when the music reached the long, lingering note of the horn, her left hand lifted and began tapping the rhythm against the blanket again. Adeline had to turn away so the old woman wouldn't see her face. Then, one afternoon, Rosalind insisted on going down to the parlor. She said it 3 times that day, each time more clearly than before. And at last, Adeline called for another attendant, took Rosalind down in the small elevator in the east wing, and pushed the wheelchair close to the piano beneath its velvet cover. Adeline pulled the cloth away. The lid opened, and dust floated through the last light of the day. The old woman studied the keys for a long time. Then she extended her left hand, and Adeline supported her elbow and lowered her fingers onto the keys. Rosalind played 3 separate notes, then a pause, then 5 notes, then another pause. Then she began again. It formed no melody and no chord, only the same sequence repeated over and over until her hand grew tired and fell into her lap. Adeline asked what she was trying to say. The old woman merely looked at her, and there was something in her eyes Adeline couldn't read, something urgent and pleading. Then she raised her hand and played the sequence again. Ashby came to examine her the following day. He listened to the story about the piano, nodded thoughtfully, wrote something in the medical record, and said it was a typical example of meaningless repetitive behavior in a patient with advanced cognitive decline, the patient clinging to old movements without understanding what they meant anymore. He said it directly in front of the old woman, in the voice people used when speaking about furniture. Sloane stood beside him, nodded, and said how sad it was. Adeline didn't argue. She wrote down every word he said in her notebook, and beside it, she added this line. She repeats exactly the same sequence without a single mistake, 4 days in a row. A person losing her memory couldn't repeat it with that kind of precision. The truth broke open late one afternoon, while Adeline was cleaning the record player. The needle arm had begun slipping from the groove near the end, and she thought dust might have collected beneath the machine, so she lifted the entire player from the table to clean the bottom. There, Carved into the wood underneath with something sharp was a sequence of numbers, shallow and old, darkened by time. It wasn't the manufacturer's serial number. The serial number appeared on a paper label in the opposite corner. These numbers had been written by hand, slanted, the final stroke drawn out in the same way as the faded pencil marks on the record cover. Adeline sat down on the floor with the player in her lap and stared at the numbers, and something in her mind began moving very slowly, like a heavy door being pushed open. The old woman had taught piano in Hyde Park for decades. She had taught her own son from the time he was small, and the way children were taught to read music was by numbering the steps of the scale, first, second, third, so they could remember where to place their fingers before they learned the names of the notes. 3 notes, 5 notes. Adeline ran down to the parlor, opened the piano, placed her fingers on the exact keys the old woman had been striking, and counted. Then she ran back upstairs, knelt beside the wheelchair, and recited the entire sequence carved beneath the record player. Slowly, 1 digit at a time. Rosalind began to cry. She couldn't speak a single sentence. Tears ran down the right side of her face, the side that could no longer move, and her left hand closed around Adeline's so tightly that her nails dug into Adeline's skin. It took another 2 days to fit everything together. The sequence wasn't the code to a safe. It was a safe deposit box number, and the final 9 digits were an account number. Adeline took it to a small bank on 53rd Street in Hyde Park, a gray stone building the old woman had walked past every day during all the years she was still teaching. The elderly clerk behind the counter checked the records, looked up, and said that yes, the box was still there. It had been rented a very long time ago, and its fee was still being paid regularly each year. It was registered in the name of Rosalind Marchetti, her maiden name. Adeline didn't open the safe deposit box right away. Before doing anything with the sequence of numbers, she wanted to understand where she stood, and there was only one person in the world who could tell her. She found Marguerite Delacroix's address in an old directory from the Nursing Association, an apartment in Pilsen on the southwest side, on the 2nd floor of a red brick building directly above a bakery. She climbed the narrow wooden staircase and smelled cinnamon before she reached the top, a sweet, warm scent slipping through the cracks between the boards, a scent she had never once encountered in the house beside the lake. Marguerite opened the door and didn't appear surprised in the slightest. She merely stepped back, told Adeline to come inside before she caught cold, then closed the door behind her. The kitchen was small and bright, its window overlooking the uneven rooftops of the neighborhood. On the table lay a stack of brown bakery paper and an open box of colored pencils. Sitting on a tall chair pulled close to the table was a little girl of about 6, her curly hair tied into 2 bunches, her head bent over a drawing. She looked up at Adeline and smiled, revealing a gap where one of her front teeth had recently fallen out, then held up the paper for her to see. On it was a purple cat with 6 legs. Adeline sat down and said it was the most beautiful cat she had ever seen, then asked why it had 6 legs. The little girl said it could run faster that way, then bent over her drawing again, singing a song she had invented herself, one that didn't rhyme at all, about the cat, cinnamon rolls, and something to do with Saturday. Marguerite poured Adeline a cup of tea and said the child was Junie, her granddaughter, whose mother worked the afternoon shift at the bakery downstairs. The 2 women sat listening to the little girl sing for a while longer. Then Marguerite told Junie to take her colored pencils into the next room and finish her drawing where she would have more space, promising to bring her a pastry fresh from the oven in a little while. The child slid down from the chair, gathered the entire stack of paper and the box of pencils into her arms, and ran into the other room. The door closed behind her, though her singing continued to drift through for a while. Only then did Marguerite set down her teacup. She said she had been waiting for Adeline to come there for many months. She explained that she had cared for Rosalind Castellano for nearly 4 years, that she had been the first person to notice the prescription had been changed, and that she had asked Ashby a single question about the dosage. Within 4 hours, she had been dismissed with 3 months of pay and a confidentiality agreement regarding the family, which she had signed because she had been too frightened to refuse. She said that for many nights afterward, she had lain awake thinking about the woman alone on the 2nd floor of that house, knowing that if she couldn't place someone there to take her place, no one would ever see what was happening again. Adeline set down her teacup, her voice turning hoarse. She said Marguerite had chosen her because she was desperate, had sat beside her at the bus stop that evening with all the information already in hand, had pushed her into a house while knowing exactly what was happening inside, and had turned her into a pawn without asking her a single question. Marguerite didn't argue. She looked down at her hands resting on the table, the hands of someone who had spent 30 years in that profession, then raised her eyes and said that yes, she had done exactly that, and if she had to choose again, she would still do the same thing. She had already stood outside that door once, and she knew precisely the cost of walking away. Adeline hadn't known it yet. Then Marguerite added one more thing, very softly. She hadn't been looking for someone desperate. She had been looking for someone who wouldn't walk away, and she was sorry that she had been right. Adeline sat in silence. From the next room, the little girl's song continued to drift through, broken and cheerful, about a purple cat with 6 legs. Marguerite had kept one thing before signing the confidentiality agreement, and she took it from a tin recipe box in the kitchen cabinet. It was a copy of the original prescription, signed by Dr. Feldman, and clearly dated, proof of what the dosage had been before Ashby ever set foot inside that house. But she said the document alone wasn't enough, because Ashby would claim he had adjusted the medication according to his professional judgment, and no one could prove otherwise. She said Adeline needed to discover how desperately Sloane Whitmore needed money, because motive was what made people believe, so Adeline began searching for one. It took her nearly 2 weeks. She examined the public records for the real estate investment fund registered in Sloane's name, followed them through the list of related business entities, and then traced the names of the beneficial owners behind them. That search led her to the County Property Records Archive in the basement of a government building on Randolph Street, where paper copies of records that had never been digitized were still kept. She spent 3 entire afternoons there, sitting between rows of metal shelves that reached the ceiling, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, turning through inspection reports and renovation permits one file at a time, and she found the name. It wasn't Sloane. The person behind every one of those entities was her brother, Royce Whitmore. Adeline wrote the name down. Then she turned to the inventory of properties held by his companies, a long list composed mostly of low-rent apartment buildings scattered across the South Side. She skimmed through the addresses one by one. Then she stopped. There was one address she didn't need to read twice. She had driven past it on the first anniversary of Elliot's death. She had stood on the opposite sidewalk for more than an hour, staring at the blackened frame of the building behind its metal barricade, until night had completely fallen. Adeline sat very still. Then she pulled the building's file from the shelf and opened it on the floor. Inside was the complete set of technical documents for the property. Annual fire safety inspection reports, signed, stamped, and complete. She turned to the investigation report filed after the fire, to the technical appendix the newspapers had never published, and read every line with the eyes of someone who had spent 4 years studying medical records and knew how to find the places where people hid things. The central fire alarm system had been disconnected from its power source nearly a year earlier. The sprinkler system on the top 3 floors had no water in its pipes. The rear emergency exits had been permanently secured with welded bars, though no one could determine when they had been installed. And the 3 most recent inspection reports, 3 sheets bearing red seals and hurried signatures, had all been signed by the same inspector. His name appeared in another list inside the file beside it, a record of consulting payments made by Royce Whitmore's company for 3 consecutive years. Nothing in that building had worked. Everything had existed only on paper, exactly like the vial of medication assigned to a dead batch number. Adeline sat on the cold concrete floor between 2 rows of shelves, the file open across her lap, and heard the fluorescent lights buzzing above her with such clarity that the sound seemed to fill her entire skull. Elliot had run into that building. He had entered while his crew was still laying out the hoses at the front. He had carried 3 people outside. He had gone back in a 4th time and never come out again. For more than a year afterward, she had lived with the belief that it had been an accident, that it was simply one of the risks of the profession he had chosen, that no one was to blame and she had to learn how to accept it. She had stood at his funeral and listened as people called him a hero. She had nodded. She had thanked every one of them. Now, sitting on the floor of that basement, she looked down at the 3 inspection reports bearing red seals and understood that her husband had run into a building where no one should ever have been permitted to live, that someone had signed papers allowing it, and that the man who had paid for those signatures was preparing to attend a wedding in Lake Forest. Her chest tightened. She tried to breathe, but the air wouldn't travel deep enough. She folded forward, one hand braced against the floor and the other resting over her belly, and remained that way until her breathing returned. Then she raised her head. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, pulled the file closer, took out her phone, and began taking photographs. 1 page at a time. She photographed all 327 pages. The elderly clerk at the bank on 53rd Street led her down to the basement, checked the authorization signature Rosalind had written many years earlier, when her hand was still steady, compared it with Adeline's identification, then took out the bank's key and inserted it into the first lock. Adeline placed the old woman's key into the second. The long metal box slid out, heavier than she had expected. The clerk left her alone in the small windowless room and closed the door. There were 3 things inside the box. The first was a thick set of documents bound in a blue cover. An amendment to the Castellano family trust, signed and notarized, revoking every provision that would allow her son's future spouse to assume control if Rosalind became incapacitated or died, and transferring that entire portion to a music scholarship fund bearing her husband's name. The second was a medical file, prepared by an independent neurologist in Evanston, accompanied by the results of a complete cognitive assessment, stating clearly that the patient suffered severe motor impairment, but had normal cognitive function, with no sign of dementia in any form. The file had been completed only 3 weeks before Ashby entered the house. The third was a sealed yellow envelope, with Emmett's name written across the front in handwriting that slanted as before, but trembled far more than the signature on the first document. Beneath it was a brief instruction stating that no one but Emmett was to open it. Adeline sat looking at those 3 things for a long time. The woman everyone in that house called confused had prepared everything before the person hunting her ever crossed the threshold. Adeline placed it all inside her briefcase, held it against her chest, and stepped outside. Snow had begun falling at noon, and by the time she set out, it was coming down so heavily that the windshield wipers couldn't keep pace. She chose the lakefront route because it was the shortest road north. The vehicle following her appeared near the Park District, its headlights higher than those of an ordinary car, maintaining the same distance through 3 turns. Adeline changed lanes. It followed. She accelerated, and her hands began growing damp inside her gloves. Then it pulled up on her left, moved close, and forced her over. She turned the wheel to the right on the ice-covered road, and the car no longer answered her. It slid sideways for a long distance, moving with terrible slowness and silence, until the front wheels dropped over the edge of the roadside drainage ditch, and the entire vehicle tipped onto its side. The window on the left shattered. Snow rushed inside. Adeline lay sideways in the driver's compartment with the seatbelt tightening across her chest, and for several seconds she heard nothing but the engine still running. Then she released the belt, pushed open the door above her, and crawled out. She placed one hand across her belly and kept it there for the entire climb out of the ditch, while her other arm held the briefcase tightly against her. She had dragged herself about 30 feet across the snow-covered grass when light swept over the ground in front of her. 2 high headlights. The other vehicle had stopped on the shoulder above, and its beams moved slowly across the snow, searching. Adeline flattened herself against the ground, pressed her face into the bitterly cold snow, and held her breath. Nearly 25 miles to the north, Emmett Castellano was driving through the storm, with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping his phone. Gideon Vance had called him at dusk to say that her car had lost its tracking signal along the lakefront and hadn't reappeared. Emmett called her number 17 times. 17 times it rang and went to voicemail, and 17 times he spoke her name into the machine, his voice growing hoarser each time, until on the final call he said nothing at all and simply let the recording continue. His car skidded twice on the overpass. He didn't slow down. Down in the drainage ditch, just as the headlights were sweeping toward the place where Adeline lay, there came the sound of brakes locking on ice and a horn blaring again and again, the rough, hoarse horn of a delivery truck that had grown too old for the road. The small truck, painted with the name of a bakery in Pilsen, stopped sideways across the road with its hazard lights flashing, and the passenger door flew open. Marguerite Delacroix jumped down, waded through snow that reached her calves, seized Adeline's arm, and pulled her up with both hands. She didn't ask a single question. She pushed Adeline into the front seat, slammed the door, and the truck roared away while the briefcase remained secure in Adeline's lap. Emmett arrived 10 minutes later. The red and blue lights of a patrol car were sweeping across the snow. Adeline's vehicle lay on its side in the ditch with the door open, and an officer told him that someone had taken the woman who had been driving away before they arrived. Emmett stood beside the road in the wind, his coat unfastened, snow lying white across both shoulders. Everyone in that city called him when they needed something handled. That night, for the first time in his life, he understood that there were things which, once they had happened, made power meaningless, because he had arrived too late. Marguerite drove her back to the apartment in Pilsen and wouldn't allow her to go anywhere for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Adeline called Emmett from the bakery's landline and said only one sentence. She had something his mother had left for him, and she wouldn't bring it to that house. He arrived 40 minutes later. He came alone, without Gideon and without another car following him, and stood at the top of the narrow wooden staircase with melting snow still darkening the shoulders of his coat until Adeline opened the door. Marguerite had already taken Junie to play at a neighbor's home, so only 2 people remained in the kitchen, along with the fading scent of cinnamon. Adeline placed the briefcase on the table. She gave him the trust documents first. He turned through them, read the provisions that had been revoked, and his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then she handed him the medical file prepared by the neurologist in Evanston, and this time he read much more slowly. He read to the final page, then read the conclusion one more time. He placed it on the table and sat in silence for a long while, his hands resting on either side of the document, as though holding it in place so it couldn't blow away. Then Adeline took out the yellow envelope and pushed it across the table toward him. He looked at the name written in slanted handwriting across the front, and she saw his shoulders sink slightly, so faintly that it was the kind of movement a man like him would never normally allow anyone to witness. He tore open the edge of the envelope with his thumb. Inside were 4 handwritten pages. The writing on the first remained clear. By the third, it had begun to tremble and slope toward the lower edge, the evidence of someone who had been forced to write during several different sittings. He read the letter standing up. Adeline didn't look at the pages. She watched his face, and through it, she read the letter one passage at a time. His mother wrote about the years after his father died, when Emmett was still young, and their family was slowly being crushed by a man who intended to take everything her husband had left behind. She wrote that she had gone to find that man and spoken to him alone, and that she had made a decision that afternoon, while knowing exactly what the consequences would be. The man never returned. She offered no details. She wrote only that she had done it when her son was still too young to understand that he was being saved, and that she had carried it with her ever since, carried it into every Christmas celebration, every time she sat listening to him play the piano, and every night she lay awake listening to his car return home late. She wrote that she wasn't asking him to forgive her because she wasn't certain she wanted to be forgiven. Then, on the final page, in handwriting that slanted sharply downward, she wrote that she knew someone was using the truth to bind his hands. She knew he was remaining silent for her, and she didn't want her son to pay for one more day for something he had neither done nor chosen. She wrote that if he was reading those words, it meant she could no longer speak the truth herself, and she asked him to do what was right for her, even if doing what was right meant bringing his own mother before the law. Emmett finished reading. He folded the 4 pages with great care along their original creases and returned them to the envelope. Then he placed both hands on the edge of the table and lowered his head. He didn't make a sound. Adeline sat across from him, less than 3 feet away, watching the shoulders of the man the entire city feared begin to tremble in the small kitchen above a bakery, and she understood that for the past 7 months she had seen him incorrectly. He wasn't blind. He had never been blind. After a very long time, he raised his head and told her everything. He said he had known since the fall. He said that when Sloane began replacing people in the house, he had ordered Gideon Vance to investigate her, and within 3 weeks Gideon brought him a file showing that her investment fund was losing money beyond any hope of recovery, that for nearly 2 years she had been using one investor's money to pay another. He said he had intended to end everything that same week. Then Sloane came to see him and placed something else on his desk. It wasn't evidence against him. It was evidence against his mother. Evidence of what had happened many years earlier, something he hadn't known about until that evening. She told him very simply that if anything happened to her, the file would go directly to the prosecutor's office, and a 74-year-old woman paralyzed on one side would have to answer questions she no longer had the strength to answer. Emmett said he had remained in the study all that night. Then he chose silence. He kept Sloane in the house, kept the wedding on the calendar, and kept everything unchanged, because he believed that as long as she thought she was about to have everything, his mother would be safe. He spoke that final sentence more slowly than all the others, and his voice broke on the word safe. Adeline stood. She walked around the end of the table, and she slapped him. Her hand struck his cheek with a clean, dry sound in that small kitchen, hard enough to turn his face aside. At the doorway, Gideon Vance had just reached the top of the stairs, and he stepped into the room with one hand already raised inside his coat. Emmett didn't turn his head. He merely extended his left hand, palm facing Gideon, and held it there. Gideon stopped. No one in the kitchen breathed. Adeline said that while he sat calculating whether keeping Sloane close would make his mother safer, the old woman had been lying alone on the second floor every night while that woman came and went from her room, and the only person in the house who had seen what was happening had been dismissed by him in his own study. She said he had protected his mother from a courtroom and delivered her into the hands of someone counting down the days. Then she stepped back, sat down, and said nothing more. Emmett stood there with a red mark across his cheek, and he didn't argue a single word. 3 nights later, he came home late, with one side of his clothing dark and wet beneath his coat. He wouldn't allow anyone to call Ashby. He wouldn't allow anyone to be called at all. Adeline was the only other person in the house that night because she had dismissed the entire staff after dinner, exercising the authority he had given her in the hospital. She told him to sit on the stool beside the kitchen table beneath the low-hanging lamp, then opened her medical kit. She cleaned the wound, administered a local anesthetic, and stitched it closed. Her hands didn't tremble once. He sat motionless throughout, his eyes fixed on the empty wall before him, and only when she had nearly finished did he speak. He asked why she hadn't once asked what had happened to him. Adeline didn't look up. She said she had worked night shifts at St. Brendan for 4 years, and she had stitched wounds for people brought in at 3 in the morning who couldn't say their own names, couldn't say where they had come from, and couldn't say who had done it to them. She said she had learned long ago that her work was to keep people alive until morning, and the rest was for someone else to handle. Then she added, more softly, that if he wanted to tell her, she would listen, but she wouldn't ask. He didn't tell her. She cut the final thread with a pair of small scissors, and as she withdrew her hand, he reached up and took hold of her wrist. Not tightly. He held her exactly where the metal stopwatch hung loosely around her left wrist, his thumb resting against the scratched glass, and he kept his hand there. Adeline didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke. The low-hanging lamp gave a faint hum and then fell silent, while beyond the kitchen window, snow continued falling onto the black surface of the lake. It happened on the night before the notarization appointment, when a snowstorm swept in from the lake, and every flight departing Midway Airport was delayed indefinitely. Adeline didn't know that. She knew only that Emmett had left that afternoon and wouldn't return before the end of the weekend. She remained in the armchair beside the bed until the old woman was fully asleep, then went downstairs to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, drank it while standing at the counter, and returned upstairs. When she reached the top of the staircase, she saw that the bedroom door was partly open, and the line of light beyond it was wider than the one she had left behind. Adeline pushed the door open, lunged forward, and wrenched Sloane backward by her hair just as the pillow fell to the floor. From the moment the hallway light came on, everything happened very quickly. Emmett crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't say a word. With one hand, he seized Sloane, pushed her against the wall beside the wardrobe, and held her there with his forearm across her chest. He didn't squeeze. He merely held her, the way someone might pin something in place to keep it from running. She began to speak. Her words came very quickly. She said he didn't understand, that she had only gone in to adjust his mother's pillow, that the nurse had been suspended and was inventing stories, and that he had to listen to everything she had to say. Emmett didn't answer a single word. He turned toward Adeline and asked how his mother was. Adeline was already beside the bed. She said Rosalind was breathing. Her pulse was fast but steady, and she needed him to open the window slightly. He spoke to Gideon in the hallway, and 3 seconds later the window opened, cold air flooding into the room. Adeline bent close and whispered into the old woman's ear that she should breathe slowly, that Adeline was there, and that no one else was in the room now. Rosalind's left hand found her wrist and held on. Sloane was still talking. She began calling Emmett by name, then said he knew exactly what she held in her hands, that if he did this, the whole world would know by morning what his mother had done. Her voice broke as she spoke. There was nothing gentle left in it, and in that moment, she bore no resemblance at all to the woman who had always sat smiling at the head of the dinner table. Emmett looked at her. Then he spoke his first words of the entire night, very softly. He told her to send it. She fell silent. He added that she could send it anywhere she wanted, that she could send it that very night, and that the only thing she had just lost was the leverage she had used to remain inside his house for all those months. Gideon called the state police. It took them nearly an hour to arrive, their vehicle moving slowly along the ice-covered road, its rotating red and blue lights sweeping across the pine trees and washing over the bedroom ceiling in waves. While they waited, Emmett didn't leave his position. Sloane sat on the floor beside the wardrobe with both arms wrapped around her knees, and she said nothing more. Adeline didn't look in her direction even once. She adjusted the pillows, checked Rosalind's pulse, recorded the time, and wrote down every reading. She did all of it, with her left hand remaining still inside the old woman's grasp. When the officers entered the room, Sloane Whitmore stood, smoothed her hair, and walked out between the 2 uniformed officers with her back as straight as though she were crossing the lobby of a hotel. At the doorway, she stopped. She turned and looked at Adeline. She looked at her for a long time, and there was no fear in her face, No hatred, only something almost like pity. Then she told Adeline to remember that night well, because it was the last time she would ever believe she had won. Then she stepped into the hallway. Adeline remained where she was, with the notebook in her hand, listening to Sloane's footsteps recede down the staircase. And she didn't understand why those words sent a chill through her entire body. Adeline understood what those words meant on the afternoon of the third day. The family attorney called the house, speaking in the measured voice of a man who had already read the outcome and was trying to deliver it with as little pain as possible. He said the prosecutors had requested Rosalind Castellano's complete medical records from the archival system, and they had received them. Then he said there was a problem. Throughout her entire electronic record, from the earliest notes after her stroke to her most recent examination, everything agreed on one point. The patient had been diagnosed with progressive dementia, with documented episodes of disorientation, visual hallucinations, and meaningless repetitive behavior. There was even an entry stating that the patient had accused members of her family of trying to harm her on several occasions, accompanied by a note explaining that such accusations were a common form of delusion at this stage of the disease. Adeline asked about the records from the neurologist in Evanston. The attorney fell silent for a moment, then said the documents still existed on paper, but there was no record in the system of any examination taking place at that time, and the other side had argued that the family had privately taken the patient to a physician for the purpose of a property dispute. He said that when a witness's testimony was contradicted by her own medical records, the court would stop listening, even if every word the witness spoke was true. Adeline asked about herself. The attorney said she was the only witness, and she was currently under investigation by the Illinois Board of Nursing over allegations involving missing controlled substances, and the defense would raise that fact within the first 5 minutes. He said he was very sorry. She set down the receiver and stood motionless in the hallway for a long time. She thought of that night in the basement of the building on Randolph Street, of the dead lot number, of the vial of morphine that had never existed. The same hand, the same system. The person who had created a vial of medicine on paper was the same person who had rewritten an entire life on paper, and they had begun doing it long before anyone had thought to suspect a thing. Sloane Whitmore was released on bail the following morning. By noon, every charge had been dropped, and the official report stated that there were insufficient grounds for prosecution because the victim lacked the capacity to testify, and the only witness was currently suspended from professional practice. She returned to the house by the lake in the early afternoon, and she came through the front door. Adeline was standing at the top of the staircase when she heard the wheels of a suitcase rolling across the stone floor of the entrance hall. A steady, unhurried sound, slow and utterly without haste. She descended 3 steps and stopped. Sloane stood in the middle of the hall, wearing the familiar cream-colored coat, one hand resting on the handle of her suitcase. Her hair once again brushed neatly into place, and she lifted her eyes to Adeline. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she smiled. It wasn't the smile she wore at parties, nor the gentle smile she used at the dinner table. This was a very small smile, almost a weary one. The smile of someone who had just finished a task whose outcome she had known from the beginning. She said she had a few things to collect from upstairs, that she wouldn't be staying long, and that according to the documents, she was still the fiancée of the owner of this house until someone signed another piece of paper saying otherwise. Then she pulled her suitcase across the hall toward the stairs. Adeline didn't move. Sloane passed within less than an arm's length of her, exactly as she had once passed the wheelchair at the turn in the hallway on the night of the engagement party. She didn't look at Adeline again. From the second floor came the familiar music, because Adeline had lowered the needle before going downstairs, and those slow piano notes drifted through the great hall, drifted past the suitcase climbing one step at a time, drifted past the woman standing rooted to the staircase, unable to think of a single thing she could do. Adeline called Delphine at St. Brendan again, and this time she didn't ask about the medication. She asked about the access logs. Every action taken within the pharmaceutical management system left a trail that included an employee identification code, a timestamp, and a computer address. And it took Delphine 4 days to obtain an extract from the Information Technology Department under the pretext of conducting an internal review. She sent it by regular mail, not electronically. Adeline opened the envelope in her room and read the pages beneath the light of her desk lamp. The records showed that the entry creating the vial of morphine with the dead lot number had been made using the credentials of a pharmacist who had retired long ago, an account that should have been locked. But the computer address couldn't lie. It hadn't originated at the hospital. It had come from a residential internet connection in Lake Forest, from inside this very house. Adeline sat before that sheet of paper for a long time. Then she went downstairs, walked along the west hallway, and stopped outside the door to the housekeeper's room. She didn't knock. She simply stood there and remembered. She remembered the apron of a different color that had been handed to her with both hands on the night of the engagement party. She remembered the folder of insurance papers that had sent her down to the harbor on that particular morning. She remembered the letter from the Board of Nursing being placed directly into her hands. She remembered him saying that the car would be waiting in 1 hour. She remembered that for 7 months, the only person in this house who had known exactly where she was going, when she was going, and why, was the straight-backed man whose voice never rose above what was necessary. She told Emmett everything that evening in the study. He listened without interrupting her once, and when she finished, he rose, walked to the window, and stood with his back to her for a long time. Then he spoke Halloran's full name, followed by another name, a different surname, and said that it was the name Halloran had borne, before changing it. Adeline didn't understand. Emmett turned around and told her that the man who had never returned in his mother's letter had carried that same surname. Halloran was his younger brother. He had applied for a position in this house less than 2 years after it happened, arriving with spotless references, never making a single mistake through decades of service, standing behind 3 generations of this family through every meal, every funeral, every Christmas. Emmett said that when his father died, Halloran had been the one who held his coat at the cemetery. They found everything in Halloran's room the following morning. An old laptop containing complete activity logs that hadn't been erased. Copies of Rosalind's and Emmett's schedules, printed and underlined, then sent regularly for more than a year to a mailbox belonging to one of Royce Whitmore's corporate entities. Rosalind's electronic medical records, altered in stages over the course of months, 1 line at a time, slowly enough that no one would notice. And a tin box filled with unopened blister packs of the same medication as the ivory white pill Adeline had wrapped in wax paper. Not a single dollar had been transferred into his account. There wasn't one payment from the Whitmores. He had done all of it, without accepting a cent. When Emmett asked him why, the man merely sat in a chair in the small east dining room, his back still straight, both hands resting on his knees, and said that he had waited for decades to watch that woman lose everything in precisely the same way his family had lost everything. Slowly, silently, with no one believing them and no one coming to save them. He said he had needed only one person greedy enough to carry out the final act, and Royce Whitmore had brought his younger sister to the house the moment Halloran suggested it. Then he said he had no regrets, and asked permission to change his clothes before the police arrived. But it didn't end there. That afternoon, Gideon Vance called from the harbor and said Royce Whitmore had sent men to seize Warehouse 4, where he was holding all the original ledgers, along with Marguerite Delacroix, whom Gideon had arranged to move to a safe place 3 days earlier. Emmett asked how Royce had known where she was. There were exactly 2 beats of silence on the other end of the line. Then Gideon said he was the one who had told him, and he hung up. He went alone. Adeline stood in the entrance hall and told him it was the most insane thing she had ever heard, that they were waiting for him there, that he had an entire team and ought to use it. Emmett buttoned his coat and said that if he brought his men, the night would end the same way the story in his mother's letter had ended, and he had no intention of allowing that to happen one more time in this family. Then he picked up a slim leather briefcase and walked out the door. Fog rose from the Calumet River so thick that the high-powered lights over the container yard were reduced to pale streaks, suspended in the air, unable to reach the ground. He entered on foot through the south gate, walking between 2 walls of steel containers stacked 4 levels high, while the sound of his shoes echoed back from both sides at once. Royce Whitmore was waiting for him in the open space before Warehouse 4, a large, tall man in an expensive coat, with 4 men standing several paces away on either side. He said he hadn't expected Emmett Castellano to arrive empty-handed. Emmett set the briefcase on the damp concrete and said it contained the complete records for 3 buildings, whose inspection reports Royce had paid people to falsify, and that the originals had been moved somewhere else that morning. Royce laughed. He said papers meant nothing between 2 men like them. Then he told his men to stay where they were, stripped off his coat and threw it aside, and stepped forward. He struck first. Emmett let the punch pass close beside his ear, turned with its momentum, caught Royce by the wrist, and twisted it backward, then drove his elbow once into the center of the man's chest. 3 movements. Royce Whitmore fell back onto the concrete and couldn't rise at once. Emmett didn't hit him again. He stepped back, bent down to retrieve the briefcase, and told the other 4 men that the old woman inside the warehouse had nothing to do with their business, and that if any of them wanted to leave before daybreak, Now was the time. The warehouse door opened. Gideon Vance emerged with one hand supporting Marguerite Delacroix, and he guided her across the open space toward Emmett, without looking at Royce even once. Only then did Adeline understand what had truly happened, because she was sitting in a car outside the yard gate, listening to everything through the line Gideon had left open since that afternoon. He had never betrayed them. He was the only man Emmett trusted enough to send all the way to the other side, and only the two of them had known the plan, because if a third person had known, it would have failed before it ever began. Royce rose to his feet. He understood everything in a single instant, and his hand went inside his coat. Gideon saw it before Emmett did. He shoved Marguerite to the left and took one step to the right. Only one step, just enough to place himself between them. The gunshot tore through the fog and struck the steel walls, returning as a confusion of overlapping blasts. Gideon crumpled. At that same moment, the entire container yard blazed with light. It wasn't one lamp, but dozens igniting at once from all four sides. Floodlights mounted on the roofs of vehicles that had been waiting along the perimeter for some time, and a voice over a loudspeaker ordered everyone to lie down with their hands on their heads. Emmett had sent the coordinates and the time to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois that afternoon. Before buttoning his coat in the entrance hall, he didn't lie down. He ran to Gideon, dropped to his knees on the damp concrete, and lifted the man's head into his hands. Gideon Vance had walked beside Emmett's father before Emmett had learned to walk, had driven him to school, had stood behind him in every room for more years than either of them could count. Emmett called his name and said the ambulance was coming, that he had to hold on, that he shouldn't say anything. Gideon spoke anyway. He gripped the front of Emmett's coat, pulled him closer, and his voice was very quiet. He said the baby would be born soon, and that the child needed to grow up in a house where no one had to lock a bedroom door. Then he tightened his grip on the coat one last time and let go. Outside the yard gate, Adeline pushed open the car door and stepped out. She heard those words through the open line, heard every one of them clearly, and she stopped in the middle of the fog with one hand resting over her belly, surrounded by beams of light sweeping back and forth across the container yard, and she couldn't take another step. They reached the house by the lake when dawn was near, and the snow had stopped falling. Halloran was still there, sitting in a chair in the small east dining room, dressed in clean clothes, his hands resting on his knees, with two men employed by the family standing on either side of the door. He didn't look up when Emmett passed. Someone else was waiting in the study, a man of about 50 whom Adeline had never seen in the house before. He offered no words of sympathy for Gideon. He merely placed a phone on the desk, pushed it toward Emmett, and said it would take only one call. He said the federal authorities were holding Royce Whitmore, but men still had to walk through hallways, still had to sleep somewhere, and still had relatives conducting business in 3 cities. He said that by the following morning, no one bearing that name would be able to do business in this state again, and that this was what everyone expected of Emmett, because tonight they had lost Gideon Vance. Emmett picked up the phone. He held it for a long time. There were still stains from the damp concrete on the knees of his coat. His hand was still trembling slightly near his smallest finger, and no one in the room dared breathe too loudly. Adeline stood in the doorway. She had been there all along, and she didn't step inside. She simply said, loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, that her husband had run into a burning building 4 times in a single night, and he hadn't stopped at the entrance to ask who the people inside were, how they had lived, or whether they deserved to be saved. She said he had never come out again, and it had taken her more than a year to understand that this was exactly what had made him the man he was. Then she rested one hand over her belly and said that this baby would be born in a few weeks, and if Emmett dialed that number, the world the child would open its eyes to would be the very world he had just created all over again, with the hand now holding the phone. She spoke her final words very softly, telling him that the choice was his, and that she would stay no matter what he chose. The man of about 50 turned to look at her, then turned back toward Emmett. No one spoke. Upstairs, the record player had reached the end of the record long ago, and the needle was circling endlessly in the final groove, sending a faint, steady hiss down the staircase, the only sound in the entire house. Emmett looked at the screen of the phone in his hand. He thought of Gideon's hand gripping the front of his coat on the damp concrete, and of the words the man had spent his final breath to speak, words that mentioned no hatred and named no one, words that spoke only of a house where people didn't need to lock their bedroom doors. He placed the phone on the desk. He pushed it back toward the other man, and said there would be no call. Not tonight, not ever again. The man rose, looked at him for another moment, then picked up the phone and left the room without a word. Emmett sat down behind his desk. He pulled the desk phone toward him and dialed another number, a 10-digit number he read from the back of a business card that had been sitting in his wallet for weeks. The phone rang 3 times. Then someone answered at the other end, and Emmett Castellano gave his full name, said he was calling the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and that he wanted to talk about his own company. Marguerite came to the house 3 days after the funeral, carrying an envelope that had grown slightly crumpled from lying so long in the tin box where she kept her baking recipes. She said Gideon Vance had given it to her on the night he took her into hiding, and that he had instructed her to give it to Miss Rourke if he didn't return, and to no one else. Adeline opened it on the front steps. Inside was only half a sheet of paper, written in ballpoint pen, the handwriting large and clumsy, like the writing of a man accustomed to holding things heavier than a pen. He wrote that he was sorry for having her followed during her first 3 months, because at the time he had believed she had been planted by the other side, and he had been wrong. He wrote that if she was reading those words, then everything had happened exactly as he and the young master had planned, and that she mustn't let anyone tell her he had changed sides, because he had never changed sides in 40 years. Then he wrote one final sentence, with no exclamation mark and no farewell, asking one thing of her, that she not let that boy live the rest of his life the way his father had lived. Adeline folded the paper and sat on the steps with it in her hands for a very long time. She saw Sloane only once, in the visitor's room of the county detention center, with a thick pane of glass and 2 plastic chairs between them. Sloane had grown thinner, her hair was tied back, and she wore no makeup. She sat down and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then she said she had owed her brother since she was 24, when he had put up the money to establish her first fund after she lost money that hadn't belonged to her, and that from that day forward, she had never awakened to a single morning without thinking of that debt. She said it calmly, asking for nothing, as though she were reciting an address. Adeline sat in silence. Then she said she believed her, that she believed Sloane had her reasons, and that those reasons were probably real, and that none of it changed anything, because a 74-year-old woman had lain in her own bed, unable to breathe, and the person pressing down on her hadn't been Sloane's brother. Adeline stood. Sloane called her name once. Adeline didn't turn around. The case lasted nearly a year and a half. Emmett Castellano cooperated with the United States Attorney's Office from beginning to end, surrendering the records of 4 transportation and warehouse companies, and he pleaded guilty, under an agreement that specified a fixed prison sentence, not the lightest sentence his attorneys could have secured. Most of the family's assets were seized or liquidated to pay restitution, and within a single summer, the Castellano name vanished from the fronts of the warehouses lining the Calumet River. Rosalind Castellano wasn't prosecuted because the statute of limitations on what had happened so many years before had long since expired, but she still insisted on testifying, and they had to take her to court by ambulance so she could sit in her wheelchair and speak aloud everything she had written in the 4 pages addressed to her son. Preston Ashby's medical license was permanently revoked by the state medical board after Dr. Feldman's original prescription was produced for comparison. Halloran was sentenced on multiple charges, including unlawful intrusion into a medical data system, and he accepted every one of them without appealing a single point. As for the Southside fire, the case that had been closed and recorded as an accident, the prosecutor's office reopened it that fall after all 327 photographs, taken in a basement on Randolph Street, were submitted, together with the name of the inspector who had signed the 3 inspection reports. The little girl was born on a night near the end of winter, when the snow had begun melting into dirty water along the curbs, and the wind off the lake had lost a little of its cold. Marguerite was the one who drove Adeline to the hospital, using the same battered old bakery delivery truck, and she sat in the hallway all night with a paper bag of cinnamon rolls resting on her lap. Adeline named the baby Elliot. The nurse completing the birth certificate looked up and asked again to make sure, and Adeline said yes, that was the name, spelled exactly that way. 3 weeks later, she carried a printed photograph to the federal prison in the southern part of the state, sat down in the plastic chair before the thick pane of glass, and pressed the picture against it so he could see. Emmett Castellano looked at the photograph for a long time. He had grown thinner, his hair had been cut shorter, and he said nothing. Then he raised one hand and placed it against the glass, directly over the photograph. Adeline placed her hand against the other side, in exactly the same place. They sat that way until the guard tapped on the doorframe to tell them their time was over, and throughout all those minutes, neither of them spoke a word. The letter from the Illinois Board of Nursing arrived in the spring. Her license was fully reinstated, accompanied by a formal 1-page apology signed by the president of the board and a statement confirming that the earlier allegation had been based on falsified data. When she requested a copy of the case file for her records, she turned to the appendix and found an appeal that had been filed many months earlier by a Chicago law office, its fees paid by an unnamed third party whose identity didn't appear anywhere in the file. She stared at the date on that petition for a long time. It had been filed during the period when he was still sitting silently in his study, still nodding to that woman in front of her, still unable to speak a single honest word to Adeline. He had done it before he had found enough courage to admit that he knew. The following summer, the garden behind the small house in Evanston was filled with sunlight and the scent of freshly cut grass. The record player had been carried outside and placed on a wooden table beneath the shade of a tree, the vinyl turning slowly as the sounds of piano and brass drifted across the yard. Rosalind sat in her wheelchair beside the old piano near the porch. Her left hand was still weak, and she could play only half the piece before she had to stop and rest. But she was playing. Little Junie perched beside her on the piano bench, her curly hair tied into two bunches, one finger resting on a key as she looked up and waited. The old woman nodded. Junie pressed down. The key sounded a single note, and she burst out laughing and clapped her hands. Then, she placed her finger on the next key and looked up again, waiting for another nod. Marguerite carried a tray of cinnamon rolls into the yard and announced that anyone who didn't eat them while they were hot had no right to complain. Baby Elliot lay in her carriage beneath the tree, just learning to roll over, and every time the piano sounded, she turned her head toward it. Emmett walked through the garden gate in the early afternoon. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had walked from the bus stop at the end of the street with a cloth bag in one hand. There was no longer anyone to drive him home. There was no one standing guard at the gate. There wasn't a single person in that yard who called him the boss. Adeline rose from the porch steps and walked toward him, and he set the bag down on the grass before she had crossed even half the distance between them. Late that afternoon, when the neighbors came over, and every seat around the wooden table was taken, someone asked Rosalind about what had happened all those years before. Rosalind said people still claimed that a nurse had saved her life. Then she smiled, that smile that tilted toward one side of her face, and corrected herself. It hadn't been a nurse. It had been the woman who taught her son how to put down the phone, because a person's true power has never rested in what they are capable of doing to those who have harmed them. It lives in the moment when they hold everything they need to take revenge, and choose not to, so that those who come after them might still inherit a world worth growing up in. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, offered by someone who has nothing in her hands, becomes the very thing that changes an entire family. If the story you've just heard touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can listen together each day to more unforgettable stories. How did you feel about Adeline and Emmett's journey? What part of their story stayed with you most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.